When the lights went out in 1942, they didn't come back for years. Entire cities in Ukraine, France, and the Balkans plunged into darkness, not from storms or grid failures, but from war. And in that silence, people didn't panic. They adapted. Today, we assume electricity is a given. It hums through every hour of our lives. But when bombs fell and wires burned, survival didn't wait for power to return. Families built cold storage from dirt and straw. They lit their homes with fungus scraped from trees. They cooked food without leaving a single trail of smoke. No apps, no batteries, just knowledge passed hand to hand across generations that remembered how to live without being seen. We think survival means stocking up. But in truth, those who made it through the darkest years of the 20th century didn't rely on tools. They relied on methods. Not flashy, not easy, but proven by hunger, winter, and blackout. You're about to uncover 8 forgotten techniques that carried entire families through war without a single volt of electricity. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. Number 1. Clay and earth cold storage. In southern Italy, the sun was merciless, but beneath the olive groves, the earth stayed cool. Long before war tore through the countryside, farmers had carved storage pits into hillsides and clay banks. But when WWII severed power lines and emptied markets, these pits became lifelines. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled within hours, vegetables wilted by noon, meat turned dangerous before dusk. But in Calabria and Crete, families returned to what their great-grandparents had taught them. The earth holds memory. If you dig deep enough, it holds temperature too. They built chambers using clay, stone, and lime plaster, materials that cooled as they breathed. These earth fridges were often just a meter wide and 2 meters deep, sealed with heavy lids of slate or wood, shaded by trees or vines. Inside, milk was stored in ceramic jugs. Vegetables were layered with damp straw. Clay pots were stacked with cool water and wrapped in cloth to preserve cheese. The secret wasn't magic, it was thermal mass. The earth absorbed the heat slowly and released it even slower. In the hottest months, these chambers held temperatures near 10 degrees, enough to buy time, to keep sickness at bay, and to feed a child one more day. Families rotated food daily. Mornings were for collection, evenings for burial. It was a rhythm more precise than any electric timer. Some buried amphorae, ancient jars, halfway in soil, their long necks sticking up like sentinels. Others dug storage pits directly into cellar floors, surrounding them with stone rings to prevent collapse. In Sicily, it was common to store eggs point down in lime water inside these cool spaces. They lasted for weeks. In Greece, salted fish and olives rested in clay urns packed in cool sand. There was no hum, no light, no switch, just silence, moisture, and patience. These were not backups. They were the primary plan. And they worked even when entire cities went dark. Tech fails. But this method never did. Number 2, cloth and airflow refrigeration. In the blistering heat of North Africa, Allied troops found something unexpected. Fresh vegetables, cooling in the desert air, not inside buildings, not buried underground, but inside pots, 2 clay vessels, one within the other, with damp sand packed between them. A soaked cloth covered this top, and the food inside stayed cool for days. It wasn't a miracle, it was physics, evaporative cooling, practiced for centuries and perfected during war. This technique spread fast. Civilians in Egypt, Morocco, and even southern Spain adapted it during WWII, when ice was gone and fridges meant nothing. 2 unglazed clay pots, a smaller one nested inside a larger one. The gap between them is filled with wet sand. As the water in the sand evaporated through the porous clay, it pulled heat from the inner chamber. The result was a self-cooling container, dropping internal temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Milk lasted longer. Fruit stayed firm. Medicine could be kept safe for children. Soldiers used these Zeer pots in field hospitals. Nomads used them for decades before. But during the war, they became essential. Silent refrigerators powered only by wind and water. In Tunisia, grandmothers taught children to keep the sand moist with just a few sips of water at dawn and dusk. In Algeria, families strung their pots from shaded porches where airflow was strongest. Some even built small shelters around them, stone-lined cubbies that caught the breeze but blocked the sun. Modern prepping focuses on solar freezers and off-grid generators. But when there was no sun to spare and no parts to repair, this method thrived. No wires, no chemicals, just clay, sand, and time. Even the cloth mattered. It had to be woven loose enough to breathe, thick enough to hold water. Old linen shirts, worn-out aprons, each one became part of the cooling system. In the chaos of war, refrigeration didn't vanish. It changed shape, and those who understood air, water, and earth, not just machines, were the ones who kept their food and their families alive. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 3, underground cook stoves. In the forests of Finland and the farms of western Ukraine, smoke could mean death. A drifting column above a house told enemy planes where to bomb. A cooking fire visible from a road risked arrest, or worse. But even in silence, people needed to eat, so they dug into the ground and built stoves no one could see. These were not ordinary hearths. They were sunken fire pits with covered chimneys, known in some regions as Dakota stoves or earth ovens. A deep hole for fire, a shallow trench for airflow, and a long, horizontal flue that released smoke dozens of feet away, cooled and barely visible. The fuel? Small twigs, dry moss, birch bark, anything that burned hot and fast. Families in hiding built them behind barns, deep in forests, even inside dugouts. In wartime Ukraine, partisans cooked entire meals with no trace. The fire stayed below eye level. The smoke filtered through soil and roots, and the heat, concentrated in the pit, required far less wood than an open flame. In Finland, they used stones to retain heat long after the fire was gone. Bread dough was buried in metal tins, cooked overnight in still warm ashes. In Belarus, they cooked porridge in sealed pots, leaving them to simmer beneath coals while scouts watched for patrols. This wasn't just about cooking. It was about staying unseen. Every decision was calculated. Fires were lit only at dawn or dusk, when mist and shadow concealed the rising air. Children were taught not to cough near the flue. Wind direction was checked with wet fingers. Even the crackle of kindling was muffled with wet cloth. Modern prepping leans on propane stoves and solar ovens. But in 1943, when sound and smoke could betray you, the only safe kitchen was underground. There was no switch, no dial, just earth, air, and instinct. And still, they baked bread, boiled roots, warmed broth for the elderly, fed infants in caves. The meal wasn't just survival. It was defiance made edible. It wasn't convenient. This was a necessity wrapped in dust and silence. Number 4, hand-dug ice pits and winter caches. In the bitter north, where winters were long and electricity was scarce, cold was not the enemy, it was the resource. Across Norway, Sweden, and deep into Russia, families turned frozen lakes and snowdrifts into storage banks. They harvested ice by hand, hauled it by sled, and buried it in earth-lined pits to preserve food well into spring and beyond. Before the war, ice houses were a tradition. But when fuel was rationed and power lines fell, these pits became essential once more. Dug deep into hillsides or forest floors, they were lined with sawdust or straw, materials that trapped cold and slowed melting. Blocks of lake ice were cut with axes and pulled out in sheets, each chunk stacked like masonry, layered between insulation, sealed with thick wooden lids or bark slabs. Meat wrapped in cloth, fish sealed in tin, milk jugs sunk halfway in the frozen wall. Even in July, the interior could hold near freezing temperatures. In rural Sweden, it was common to bury ice beneath barns, while in Russian dachas, Families built small, above-ground huts with thick peat walls and ice trenches beneath the floor. It was hard labor. Children worked beside parents, hauling snow in buckets, gloves stiff with cold breath frozen on scarves. But what they were building wasn't just storage, it was insurance. Food that would otherwise rot in days now lasted for months. In some villages, neighbors shared a communal pit, each family marking their corner with carved symbols or colored twine. Modern prepping trusts generators and gas-fueled chillers. But when fuel was gone and silence was survival, it was the ice, cut by hand, buried in dark earth, that gave people time. No buttons, no wires, just winter turned backwards. In Finland, slabs of reindeer meat were stacked between frozen moss. In Karelia, jars of berries were packed in crates and layered under snow-covered hay. Everything was designed to last without light, without sound. And when the thaw finally came, the last block melting beneath a crate of eggs, it wasn't failure. It was timing. They had made it to spring. This wasn't just survival, it was memory, passed down in silence. Number 5. Salt-cured and ash-buried meat. In a world without refrigeration, meat was a race against rot. A fresh kill could feed a family for weeks, or poison them within days. But across wartime Europe, where power lines hung dead and grocery shelves were empty, people turned to ancient methods: salt, fat, and ash. In the mountains of Romania and the plains of Serbia, meat wasn't hung in smokehouses, it was sealed in salt. Cuts of pork were rubbed, layered, pressed. Every surface is packed with coarse salt mined from local springs or traded by weight like silver. After days of curing, the water was drawn out, the meat was rinsed in vinegar and hung in drafty sheds or buried in earthen jars. But in areas under threat, where storage had to remain invisible, families used ash. Cold, sifted wood ash, clean and dry, was packed around smoked meat, sometimes wrapped in cloth or bark. The ash kept insects away, absorbed moisture, and formed a sterile barrier. In Lithuania, ham legs were buried in crates beneath chicken coops, hidden from patrols. In Slovenia, slabs of fatback rested beneath layers of lye-treated ash, undisturbed for months. Fat played its part, too. Rendered lard became both preservative and protection. Meat cooked, cooled, and submerged in jars of hardened fat could last deep into winter. A sealed jar in a cool cellar meant protein long after the last firewood had burned. Modern prepping celebrates freeze-drying and vacuum packs. But in 1943, a family in Belarus survived because they salted their goat meat and buried it behind the barn. In Hungary, sausage links cured in chimneys were hidden beneath floorboards, packed in linen and ash. These weren't backups. They were the only way. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled, blood was baked into sausage, organs cured with salt and herbs. It wasn't just about survival. It was about using every part before time turned it to danger. Children knew the difference between white ash and greasy ash. Grandmothers tasted salt for sharpness, not flavor. Every cut preserved was one less meal lost. No electricity, no expiration dates. Just salt, smoke, and silence. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 6. Charcoal heat retention. In the wooden homes of wartime Japan, the nights were cruel. With fuel scarce and cities dark under blackout orders, families turned to an old solution, one that gave warmth, boiled water, and cooked rice, all without open flames or wasted wood. The answer was charcoal. Not just burned, but controlled. At the center of many homes sat the hibachi or shichirin, small, ceramic stoves fueled by slow-burning charcoal. These weren't just cooking tools. They were lifelines. A single handful of charcoal, lit at dawn, could retain heat for hours. Meals were cooked one by one, tea in the morning, porridge in the evening, each pot placed with precision over the glowing embers. But the brilliance wasn't in the flame. It was in the management. Charcoal, Unlike firewood, burned steady, clean, and quiet. In Korea and across rural China, families used earthenware braziers buried partially in the floor, shielding heat and reducing smoke to almost nothing. In the cold of Manchuria, heated stones were buried beside sleeping mats, warmed earlier by charcoal, and left to radiate through the night. Even in bomb shelters, a clay pot with two small vents, one for air, one for exhaust, became a full kitchen. Soldiers in remote outposts learned to cook silently, using pocket-sized stoves that concealed light and gave off almost no scent. No light trail, no smoke, just controlled heat in total silence. Fuel was precious. Every scrap mattered. In some villages, families saved charcoal dust, mixing it with clay to form new briquettes. Dried in the sun, these recycled coals burned low and long. Children were taught to snuff embers with pots, not water, to preserve every ounce of usable heat. Modern prepping often forgets this art. We depend on gas, solar panels, or propane tanks. But during the war, when all those failed, or never arrived, it was charcoal that kept the soup warm and the night bearable. This wasn't just fire, it was heat, rationed like breath. No buttons, no circuits, just blackened wood placed by hand, watched with care. In homes where the walls shook with silence, warmth came not from fire, but from memory, glowing beneath clay. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 8, light without flame. When blackout orders swept through occupied Europe, even a flicker could invite disaster. A single candle seen through a crack could draw a patrol. A glowing window might invite a bombing. So families learned to see in the dark, or bend it to their will. In the deep woods of Poland and forest cabins in Latvia, light didn't come from flame. It came from fungus. Bioluminescent wood, scraped from rotting logs and placed strategically along paths, offered a faint green glow, just enough to guide a footstep, mark a trail, or find a doorway. Known as foxfire, this natural light source was used by partisans and villagers alike. It couldn't be extinguished, couldn't be seen from the air, and left no scent. In southern France, crushed fireflies were mixed with animal fat and smeared onto walls near exits or latrine paths. It was dim, it was temporary, but it was safer than striking a match. In some cases, even certain seaweed extracts were used to create a weak, ghostly glow, enough to move by, never enough to be noticed. But the most common trick required no biology at all. It was salt and stone. In parts of Greece, families coated pale river rocks with brine and left them in the sun. At night, these stones would hold warmth and a faint glow, visible only up close. Enough to see your hands. Enough to change a bandage. In homes near the front, walls were painted in a mix of chalk and crushed reflective shells, catching the last of the sunlight, bouncing it through the room for minutes after sunset. Modern prepping talks about lanterns, headlamps, and solar LEDs. But in 1942, if light gave away your life, you had to think differently. The trick wasn't brightness. It was invisibility. Children were taught to count steps in the dark. Doors were padded to avoid creaks. Even talking was limited to certain rooms. And in places where movement was vital, foxfire logs were split and set along trails like markers from another world. They didn't light the dark. They adapted to it. This wasn't convenient. This instinct was sharpened by silence. And even when the world went black, they found a way to see, one forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 8, light without flame. When blackout orders swept through occupied Europe, even a flicker could invite disaster. A single candle seen through a crack could draw a patrol. A glowing window might invite a bombing. So families learned to see in the dark, or bend it to their will. In the deep woods of Poland and forest cabins in Latvia, light didn't come from flame. It came from fungus. Bioluminescent wood, scraped from rotting logs and placed strategically along paths, offered a faint green glow, just enough to guide a footstep, mark a trail, or find a doorway. Known as foxfire, This natural light source was used by partisans and villagers alike. It couldn't be extinguished, couldn't be seen from the air, and left no scent. In southern France, crushed fireflies were mixed with animal fat and smeared onto walls near exits or latrine paths. It was dim. It was temporary, but it was safer than striking a match. In some cases, even certain seaweed extracts were used to create a weak, ghostly glow, enough to move by, never enough to be noticed. But the most common trick required no biology at all. It was salt and stone. In parts of Greece, families coated pale river rocks with brine and left them in the sun. At night, these stones would hold warmth and a faint glow, visible only up close. Enough to see your hands. Enough to change a bandage. In homes near the front, walls were painted in a mix of chalk and crushed reflective shells, catching the last of the sunlight, bouncing it through the room for minutes after sunset. Modern prepping talks about lanterns, headlamps, and solar LEDs. But in 1942, if light gave away your life, you had to think differently. The trick wasn't brightness. It was invisibility. Children were taught to count steps in the dark. Doors were padded to avoid creaks. Even talking was limited to certain rooms. And in places where movement was vital, foxfire logs were split and set along trails like markers from another world. They didn't light the dark. They adapted to it. This wasn't convenient. This instinct was sharpened by silence. And even when the world went black, they found a way to see, one forgotten skill, one more day alive. Now you understand, real survival never came from gear. It came from grit. When the power died, when supply lines vanished, when help never came, people didn't fold. They remembered. They remembered how to store food underground, how to light a path without flame, how to filter water, cook in silence, and keep meat safe through winter. These weren't hobbies. They were inheritances, skills shaped by war, refined by hunger, and passed down through whispers. Today, we depend on switches, screens, and systems. But history shows us, when those fail, what remains is the human method. Hands, clay, ash, memory. These 8 techniques didn't just keep people alive. They carried entire generations through hell. Without noise, without panic, without a single volt of electricity. So the question isn't whether the grid will fail. It's whether we'll remember what to do when it does. If this knowledge moves something in you, if you felt the weight of what we've forgotten, then don't let it vanish again. Subscribe now, not for trends, not for fear, but to help preserve the wisdom they died to pass down. Because one subscription revives what the world tried to bury, and next time, it might be the only light left.